Heresy Alpha, Book 1 of the Marian Imperium, by Richard Warren. Chapter 13. Agnes. The enemy's left flank had completely disintegrated, but their right was already reforming. Strabon had acted boldly, but he was in peril now. She must come to his aid. It was now or never. Dirige frontem, Agnes called to her troops, springing into action. She hardly needed to issue the command. Spurred on by the sight of their comrades, the first line was already presenting. Green laser lights flitted across the bandits' chests. Mitte, she roared. There was a high-pitched whistling on all sides. 5 more of the enemy collapsed. Still under fire from Strabon's legionnaires, some of the bandits lost their nerve and retreated into the buildings. Agnes smiled. They were no match for her century. Still, their right flank had held, and a few had their mortars ready. Parati, Agnes said, signalling to the second line. The 8 legionnaires knelt in the sand, their hands on the little boxes beside them. Like the petals of a black rose, their ceiling unfurled to reveal tiny metallic balls illuminated by a ghostly jade light. A low clunk, a vacuum of air, and a whiz sounded in quick succession from the enemy line. Something exploded nearby, and a cry of pain went up from her line. A shell had landed in the midst of her right flank. Several legionnaires had fallen, and some of the drones had been destroyed. The clunking continued relentlessly. Another shell exploded just before her first line. How had the cursed Osmans achieved such precision with their old weapons? Yakula, she said to the second line. 6 spheres catapulted into the air like green shooting stars. They cut noiselessly through the desert night, hovering above the enemy line. Noticing this, some of the bandits raised their assault rifles and fired at the drones. Mitte, Agnes called to her first line again. Another volley took out several of the bandits before a third shell exploded close by. She was thrown backwards by its force, but quickly scrambled back to her feet. A woman of the first line lay prostrate nearby. One of her shins was missing, and all the sand around was dark with blood. She wailed piteously, but her cries were drowned out by a crash from above, as one of the drones fell limply from the sky. The mangled carcass of the metallic ball, its propellers riddled with bullets and twisted out of shape, landed in the sand not far from the first line. The night sky pulsed with the enemy's fire, but the other drones were as yet untouched. There was no time to lose. Self-identification of targets complete, Catapana, a voice hailed her from the second line. Pluvia Dolorosa ready to launch. Agnes smiled. Pain Rain, as it was affectionately known among the legions. That would do for them. She nodded. The legionnaires all tapped their wrists at once. The drones shone a luminous green over the enemy, some of whom redoubled their fire. Others lost their nerve and ran for the cover of the buildings. A light spray issued from tiny pores all over the surface of the drones. Like sea foam, it was so weightless that it might have been no more than a dampness in the night air, but as the droplets fell, they quickly reacted with it and ignited. The mist transformed into a blanket of flame that descended on the enemy line. Like some infernal glue, the little fires stuck to cloth and flesh. Cries went up on all sides. A vehicle burst into flame. Some of the bandits rolled around in the sand in a vain attempt to put out the fire engulfing them. Others ripped the flaming cloth from their bodies, but it was no use. Their front transformed into a scarlet banner in the desert night. Primi dirige frontem, Agnes shouted at the first line. It was time to put the Parcanti out of their misery. The troops raised their rifles. Lasers danced across the burning torsos. She watched with pride as the bandits flailed about helplessly. They were no match for her enemy, no match for the spear. Mitte, she said. A deafening crack rang out in answer. Several bandits fell to the ground, but the sound was louder than she'd expected. To her horror, many of her own line had also fallen. 2 of her men lay nearby in pools of blood. One was bleeding out, his chest dappled with bullet holes. The other lay lifelessly beside him. Nothing remained of where his head had been but a crimson beret. Red lasers danced across the bodies of her remaining troops. A light flashed on her own chest. She slammed herself to earth. There was a rush of air as 3 more legionnaires collapsed onto the sand, their lungs punctured. Her brain was on fire. Caliphate weapons didn't have that range, and precision rifles like that couldn't be bought in Nubia. Not for any money. Only Imperial weapons had such range, but such heresy was impossible. Engines rumbled in the distance. Beyond the fire, vehicles emerged between the buildings, out of which bandits leapt in droves. The reinforcements advanced across the open ground towards the Marian line. Every so often, one would stop, kneel, and take aim at them. A rush of air would follow as a bullet flew by. One of the black ants paused beside the remaining captive, who still struggled on the sand. There was a dull crack, and his naked body grew still. Agnes shuddered. It was fast becoming a rout. "Soskipe!" she ordered the remnant of the first line to fall back to the second. She surveyed what was left of her company. Amid the bleeding bodies of the wounded, there were others unharmed who, like her, had hit the ground in time. "Sponte!" she said, commanding them to fire at will. Another volley resounded along her line. The braver among her wounded rose to their knees and fired too, but were soon met with an answering hail of shot. Troops dropped like flies on both sides. By now she had lost nearly half her company, while, like a relentless tide, the accursed wave came on inexorably. Her legionnaires fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. There was no sign of Strabon, and to make matters worse, those bandits who had escaped the fire now joined their new comrades. The enemy's vanguard was less than a quarter verst away. Know the odds, and recognise when you need support. That was what Marcus would have said. She had to call for aerial backup from the Legion. There was no other way. She swallowed her pride. Raising her wrist in the dust, she commanded her holowatch to open a line back to her sentry on the west bank. The screen merely flashed red. She shouted at it to dial the Legion at Cain, but again it flashed red. All communications were down. She had never heard of such a thing. She rose unsteadily to her feet. Her body ached, and her head swam. None of it made any sense. She was aware of the bullets kicking around her and the desperate cries of her troops, but everything was dim somehow, as if she were underwater. All was a blur of dancing lights in the desert night, accompanied only by muffled shouting and the dull thud of shrapnel and bodies hitting the earth. "Katapana!" a cry called her back above water. A soldier limped up, her dark hair matted with sweat and sand. Though contorted with pain, Agnes was struck by her elegant Anatolian features, so out of place in that bloodbath. "Should we not call for?" the legionnaire asked, but her voice was drowned out by an explosion so deafening that it submerged the entire battle. So great was its sonic force that the soldier lost her balance and fell. Agnes too staggered, shielding her ears. It had come from behind the Marian line. She spun around in confusion, making no move to help the woman, but there was no enemy in sight. Just her 8 surviving legionnaires, collapsed back into a single rank, their teeth chattering with the clanking of their assault rifles as they sprayed the enemy in a last act of defiance. Bloodied corpses lay all around. Smrt! The word rose to her lips in her native tongue. Death! All was lost. No help was coming. They would die there. "Kerde!" Agnes commanded the retreat. The legionnaires obeyed at once. The enemy was close at hand now, and it was plain to all that they would be annihilated. Even so, a frown darkened the brows of one of the men. He was right. The shame was terrible. The Marian line never retreated. Such cravenness was extremely rare, and, for a first century, unheard of. The man leant down in an attempt to assist one of his fallen comrades as more shells exploded to left and right, cratering the sand. There wasn't even time to save their wounded, let alone bury the dead. She had to save what remained of her company. "Kerde!" she said again, glaring at the man as he tore his arm from his dying companion. Unprompted, the legends of the old patriarch commanders who had fallen on their swords rose to her mind. Would the Virgin forgive her cowardice? She began to run. The shadow of the temple loomed ahead. Her gut lurched within her. The last thing she wanted was to get entrapped there, but it was also their only way through, their only hope of survival. If they could just reach the river, they might yet rejoin the sanctuary, their salvation. She gestured at the temple, but the bandits marked their flight, and the sight emboldened them further. Their line, already chaotic, fractured as some broke ranks in headlong pursuit. Their lights extinguished, 3 of the drones still idled noiselessly, like black pearls in the desert night, forgotten by the enemy. In their eagerness, several had now reached the original position of the Marian line. Their main body followed behind, passing right under the drones. Agnes saw her chance. She had to do anything she could to buy them time. She hailed a legionnaire, lifting her eyes to the sky. "Finis pluviae," the soldier commanded her holowatch, ending the program. The drones fluoresced green like fireworks in the night sky. Then their lights died, their propellers retracted, and the little spheres fell to earth like lead, their metallic casing falling away like eggshells. The liquid inside immediately came alight as it reacted with the air. 3 giant fireballs exploded in the midst of the enemy's ranks as the sticky substance spewed in all directions. The hostile fire ceased. "Ad templum cede," Agnes said to her remaining 7 troops. Taking advantage of the confusion, they managed to put the enemy behind them again and cross the temple forecourt. Back by the sacred lake, she reviewed what was left of her company. All were uniformly ragged, and most had lost their berets. Some bled from wounds on their arms and legs. The man who had tried to help his comrade wept as he slumped against a wall, but his sobs were drowned out by an engine nearby. Agnes pulled him back to his feet. There was no time for weakness. "Exi," she commanded, as they retraced the way they had come that morning. They moved as silently as they could, but the clanking of their weapons and the dragging feet of the wounded echoed mercilessly around the lakeside, as if a hateful stone wanted to give them away. It was too loud a silence. How could they pass unnoticed? Unnoticed by whom, though? The enemy already knew they were there. The nectar had clearly addled her mind. At the end of the inner sanctum, the 3rd pylon reared up frightfully like a gargantuan night watchman. In its midst was the entrance to the hypostyle, its shadowy hollow the maw of some hound of hell. In the darkness, her troops became a pack of frightened animals once more, their startled eyes pleading with her, or else mournfully examining their torn and bloodied hides. The despoiled corpses of those she had left behind rose before her, like dead creatures on the roadside, then the shades of the Numidian villagers, and the charred faces of the woman and child. Something lurched inside. There was another rumble of engines. She raced up to the wall and dived headlong into its jaws. Once more she was back in the forests of her homeland, but a forest by night was an altogether different place. She had once lost her way in the woods as a child, and it had been well after nightfall before she had gotten out. For hours she had wandered aimlessly in a place she thought she knew. The wondrous hues of the barks had all turned a uniform black, their dark hulks transformed from friendly guides to watchful fiends. The cool shade of the trees had become the lair of wild beasts, waiting to spring her in a trap. As they filed back up the sacral highway, the bulging columns too seemed taller in the darkness. Deep, inscrutable shadows draped between them, like a heavy velvet shroud. There was no time to scout, and they were in any case too few. The enemy had vanished, but it didn't mean they weren't still being stalked like prey animals. Something moved ahead on the sacral way. She pressed against a column, her troops following suit. She scanned the way ahead with her night visor. They were already halfway through the hypostyle, and the open court was visible beyond. There was nothing there. She signalled to the column to move on, but they'd hardly taken a few steps before something again moved ahead. This time she looked with her own eyes. A lone figure walked away from them up the sacral way. Even at a distance, from their size it was obvious they weren't one of the bandits, nor were they one of hers. A white shawl and bare feet. She gasped in astonishment. It was the girl. "Katapana, what is it?" a legionnaire addressed her in a trembling voice. Agnes did not answer, but halted a stone's throw from the 2nd pylon, transfixed by the silhouette of the girl. It was impossible. How could she have made it there from Thebes? There was no way she could have passed unscathed through the hell of such a battle. Agnes looked vaguely into her subordinate's face. She too was really no more than a little girl. Her features morphed into those of a frightened mouse. Rubber scuffed on stone as gunfire crashed through the silence of the hall. A group of bandits emerged from a row of columns to their right. A bullet whizzed past Agnes' temple, and the legionnaire fell back with a cry. Agnes dived behind a column. Chips of sandstone and granite flew off the columns as the enemy sprayed bullets in all directions. Up ahead, the girl was gone. The other 6 legionnaires had taken cover. One crept around the base of a column, taking pot shots at the enemy. Another had dragged the mouse-like woman to shelter, but she was already bleeding out. It was impossible to know in the confusion of that dark forest, but some instinct told her the bandits were only an advance party. She eyed the legionnaire opposite. It was the same man who'd been reluctant to retreat before. She caught his eye, pounding her palm. He nodded, pulling a grenade from his fatigues. The bandits moved up a side aisle towards them in an undisciplined band. Periodically firing at the legionnaires, they would take cover before advancing and firing again. 2 of them had incautiously run on ahead and were only a few columns away now, so close that the red crescents on their scarves were visible. She fired at them as they came on. They leapt behind a column. She signalled to the legionnaire, who squeezed his grenade. As it flashed green, he swung his arm at the column. The disc skimmed across the sand like a coin across a pond, coming to rest beside the column just as the bandits emerged. No sooner had they raised their rifles and trained her in their sights than there was an explosion of stone and sand. Blood stained the columns as shreds of cloth and burnt metal flew through the air. Agnes nodded approvingly to the legionnaire. They'd got the damned Osmonds. There was shouting outside the hall. The explosion had given them away. They leapt to their feet, racing towards the forecourt. There were only 7 of them left, including her. She was dazed and exhausted, but the adrenaline kept her moving. If she could just reach the west bank, she could get word back to the Legion. Up ahead, 2 wounded legionnaires limped towards the hypostyle exit. Their torn fatigues morphed into animal pelts, all bloodied and shredded by merciless claws. One of them had already reached the second pylon when they collapsed under a hail of fire. There was barely time to take cover. The legionnaires were forced to retreat, sheltering beneath the columns beside the wall as bullets exploded into pillar and pedestal. It was the rest of the group that had attacked them before, having crept up on them unawares. They were 2 fewer than her remaining 6, but they'd sprung them in a trap and had the advantage. Her troops were cornered and in disarray. None paid her any heed, but cowered before the rain of fire. There wasn't even time to issue orders. The bandits were already on them. They were lambs for the slaughter. This was it. She closed her eyes, praying to Our Lady of Battlement for the gnosis of her soul. But just as she was about to rise, one of the bandits unexpectedly cried out. A second later, another fell. The remaining pair looked around in confusion, but weren't fast enough. The air sang as 2 more shots took them down as well. The firing stopped. She touched her face, unsure whether she was still alive. The gunfire had come from behind the enemy. Cautiously, she crept out of the column's shadow. On the far side of the pylon stood a solitary figure. The bandit lowered his gun and ran towards her without raising it again. Startled, she raised her rifle, but some instinct stopped her from firing. Another legionnaire made ready too, but she raised her hand. The man halted before them. Still he did not raise his weapon, though they had him in their sights. He had the dark skin and black fatigues of the bandits, and had a gash on his shin. He had clearly been in the battle too. She peered into his face as she trained her rifle on him. His nose and mouth were covered with a bandana, but she could still see his eyes. They were the clear, dark eyes of a Nubian. Of a Nubian, yes, but not a bandit. They filled her with warmth and longing. Unconsciously, she lowered her gun. The man's eyes smiled. Her companion turned to her in alarm, but the man only raised his hand and pulled off his bandana. "Strabon," Agnes said, as, forgetful of her dignity, she threw herself upon him. "Yetuzazrak, a miracle! But how in Justinia's name did you manage to escape?" "Praise be," Strabon exclaimed. "We only got out of the Meshita in the nick of time, had a scuffle with the first lot under the walls. When they came on in force, we hid out in the old city, and they overtook us unnoticed. After we attacked from behind, they pursued us back into Thebes. Our lot got divided. In the end, I only got out by taking the clothes of a hostile after I did for him." He looked down sheepishly at his outfit. Then, beholding the meagre remnant of their company, his face dropped. She didn't need to ask about the others. He simply shook his head sadly. "Katapana," Strabon said in an undertone, "there's more. They're weapons, and that man, the one who was leading them—" He was interrupted by a roar of vehicles outside. They weren't out of the woods yet. Whoever was after them was determined they'd take the truth to the grave. No command was needed. The last 7 legionnaires ran with all the strength left in them. Dashing out of the hall, they raced across the court beyond. The outer wall of the first pylon loomed before them. They were halfway there when cries erupted behind as bandits filled the arcades. Bullets whizzed past. Strabon threw a grenade. There was a mighty crash of stone, and they just managed to slip out. The shadowy hulks of the boats appeared on the shore, but first to greet them were the twin ranks of cryosphinxes, obstructing them like some demonic host. Agnes cursed the unholy images as gunfire resumed behind them. Stone horns shattered as bullets kicked about the statues. A ram's head exploded altogether, and she very nearly suffered the same fate, but by cowering and scrambling they at last reached the riverbank. Strabon and another legionnaire threw themselves down in the papyri, returning fire as the enemy came on. Agnes and the rest dived into one of the catamarans. Seconds later, its engine whirred as they pushed out onto the waves. Strabon and his companion leapt into another boat. They lay flat, their rifles trained on the shore as the self-guiding vessels sped them back to the safety of the west bank. Soon the riverbank was lined with silhouettes, like a host of black candles. Yet strangely, the bandits did not present, nor did they board the remaining boat in pursuit. She didn't understand. Her troops were still in range, but wouldn't be for much longer. She looked across the water at Strabon. He was thinking the same. On the east shore, a gaunt shadow stepped from the crowd. Despite the distance, she knew it was him, the man with the cruel laugh, the one who spoke her tongue, the one who had decimated her century. The moment passed. They were out of range. The candles became no more than a black ribbon on the horizon, undulating like a desert snake in the night. The legionnaire beside her exhaled in relief, but no one said a word. The catamaran whirred softly, rocking her like a cradle. Her head was light. It was so warm, she could almost fall asleep. It was more than warm now. It was hot. She wiped her brow. The cool of the desert night was altogether gone. It was getting hotter too, the further they went. The legionnaire's eyes were closed as he sobbed in mute exhaustion, but his tanned cheeks were drenched with sweat. Droplets clung to the end of his beard. It wasn't just her. There was something else in the background, something more than just the silence of the desert night, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the stern. A low crackling sound. It soon grew louder, rising into a storm. She touched her collar. Her neck was completely soaked in sweat. She sniffed the air and caught the whiff of pitch. Smoke. Fire. "Fire!" she exclaimed, facing the west bank. Her eyes opened wide, turning opalescent with the dancing of the flames. The entire west bank was gilded with a vast crimson band. On all sides a mighty conflagration rose into the desert night, painting its black canvas red and gold as huge chimneys of smoke blotted out the stars. In the distance, explosions could be heard, punctuated by the occasional scream. The entire camp was alight. "My century," she said, completely aghast. The words sounded unnatural, as if they hadn't come from her, as if some terrible oracle were pronouncing her doom. Heedless of her safety, she staggered to her feet. The others' surprise was overtaken by their horror. Her mouth hung open in sheer terror. The explosion, it was impossible. The enemy didn't have such weapons. Smrt. The word rose unbeckoned to her lips. Death. She looked downriver at Strabon's boat. He too had risen and was staring at the fire. Feeling her gaze, he turned, his face illuminated by the unholy light from the shore. His bright Nubian eyes bored into hers. She looked at him with a sorrow she couldn't explain, and in his eyes something answered her, a kindness that filled her with a warmth unlike that of the terrible fire, an infinite forgiveness. He smiled. As he did so, there was a great explosion. His boat lifted into the air. and he disappeared. "No," Agnes said in horror. All around her were only the terror-stricken faces of prey. The twin patriarchs smirked at her from the shore, their sandstone coloured to blood by the flames. There was another mighty bang, and the ground slipped from beneath her. She submerged into the water, and all went dark.